Well everyone, it's finally here. I'm honestly really happy to be making this video as this topic is by far my most requested video. Today, I'm happy to say we'll finally be talking about Cave Stories Beta. Now, I know I promised the fabled Mimiga and Challenge Levels videos would be out way before this video even began production, but sadly, those videos are once again put on pause. More info why at the end of the video. And before we truly get started, I just want to say thank you to a few people in the community who helped me out with this video, as tackling Cave Stories Beta was no easy feat. These people include Enlightened One, or simply Enlight, and Aya. Without them, this video would have only been a fraction of what it is, so big thank you to those two for help. I'd also like to point your attention to the Pixel Beta Content Discord server. This amazing group of people have dedicated tons of time and discovery purely for beta information on Studio Pixel games, including both Cave Story and Caro Blaster. Thanks again to all the wonderful people there. Now, I'm gonna be honest. I originally had no idea where to start this video. There's just that much content to cover. Thankfully, Pixel released an image that can sort of help us structure this video. For Cave Story's 10th anniversary, Pixel released its own development timeline, and here we can see a handful of sprites from different points in the beta's life. We even get to see screenshots and gameplay from specific eras of the beta. For the sake of organization, I'll be talking about the beta in the order of this timeline. Now, with that said, I will say it's 100% important that we truly don't know when each screenshot or build was taken, but we do have a handful of supporting evidence such as development progression and screenshot dates. But please, take the dates and builds with some level of salt. With that said, let's finally get started. We're actually going to be starting off with Cave Story's June 7th, 1999 alpha build. So I'm sorry that this video isn't entirely beta content, but the alpha of the game is so different I can't help but bring it up anyways. Amazingly, we actually have footage of Cave Story's alpha build, which Pixel showed off at a Tokyo Culture event. Here, we see a more human-like character, and Pixel goes on to show off this character in a blank but colorful world. Pixel does a lot of running around, shows off shooting, and even wall jumping, a mechanic that never made it into the final version of Cave Story. Sadly, there's not much else I could say about the alpha build. Pixel doesn't play the alpha build much, and I don't speak Japanese at all, so I can't exactly translate everything he mentions vocally in the video. If you'd like to watch the videos without background music and my voiceover, I'll leave links to all the videos used in the description below. Okay, let's move on to our first beta stop. And that's the Christmas Eve 2000 build. Sadly, we don't have any video from this version of the beta, but we do have one single screenshot. This screenshot of the build shows Quote, who's actually named Curly Brace in the beta, surrounded by tons of small enemy based on a reoccurring enemy named Pooh. This screenshot sadly doesn't show too much outside of that, however it's still really cool to see. Moving on, we'll be taking a look at the May 15th, 2001 build. This build also doesn't have any footage, but once again we do have screenshots of it. The first screenshot we have is of Curly Brace starting a boss fight with a large Pooh. Please refrain yourself from laughter. With this, we actually do have some updates to the UI. First, in the top left corner, we actually do get to see our current equipped weapon as well as ammo count for the weapon as well. Yes, for Cave Stories beta, ammo was limited. With that said, another change to weapons is the lack of a level up meter. The mechanic of leveling up weapons was not a thing in the beta at all. Moving on, we also get to see a different style of health meter for the boss fights. I honestly really like this design. It's simple and neat, but I definitely prefer the finalized health meter for the game. Making our way to the lower left corner, we get to see two more UI updates. The first is our health meter, represented by 2 empty hearts. The other, more interesting meter, is the 10 Xeon meter. This is actually your in-game currency. You'd actually have to buy your weapons and ammo in the game, assumingly from in-game stores, which we'll actually get to see later on. Alright, now that the UI has been explained, let's move on to the rest of the screenshots that this build offers. Here, we see Curly Brace moving along what appears to be an early version of the first cave, or as the beta calls it, the dim path. We'll get to see more of this exact area once we start talking about the actual beta gameplay footage. In this image, we get to see the smaller Pooh-like enemies, and for the first time, we get to see the cut coins in-game. And hey look, there's even an early chest, which doesn't look too far from the final. In the next image, we get to see Curly Brace holding a weapon not seen in Cave Story. This weapon is called the Cynical Blade, and its projectiles definitely give blade-like vibes, don't you think? We also get to see 2 enemies here that were in the timeline. we get to see these small green creatures that look like a mix of the sandcroc and gunfish. We also get to see these smaller red dragon creatures, and they look incredibly cute. This is actually the first time we get to see anything dragon related in Cave Story. It seems that even early on, Pixel knew that dragons would play some form of role in the game. This next screenshot gives us a handful to talk about. If it wasn't obvious, this is the beta inventory screen. The top left is our current weapon, and below that is labeled as plugin, which is most likely used for equipable items. In the final game, you can of course have multiple items equipped at once, but it seems like maybe at one point, you could only have one equipable item at a time. Below that is our overall inventory box. Moving on to the top right, we have our health, this time with hearts filled in, and I could be wrong, but I believe the filled in hearts basically acted like a second layer of protection. Basically, you'd lose your filled in hearts, and then once those were all out, you'd lose the outlined ones. It is also possible that the filled in hearts are all we have, and the outlined hearts just show how much health we could have at once. Anyways, below the health, we actually get to see our money and how much we have of it. It's interesting just to see how much more was in our inventory, even a view of Curly Brace themselves. Of course, Cave Story now doesn't need 3 of these boxes, so it makes sense that the final one is much more simpler. Now, I gotta take this opportunity to talk about the beta weapons. Starting from the top left in the inventory, we have the Fireball, which is much more gray compared to the orange-red that we know it as. Next to it, we have a beta version of the machine gun, which I actually don't have a name for, but I do know for sure it was the machine gun, and we will get to see more of it later on. To the right of that is the Cynical Blade, and skipping the cake, we'll be moving on to the next row, which we actually have a beta missile launcher of, and this weapon is massive compared to the finalized version of it in the original game. The weapon to the right of that, I'm unsure of the name is as well. However, move to the right one more time, and we actually get to see a beta version of the Bubbler with a whopping 2,000 bubbles. Now, keep in mind, there was no leveling up in Cave Story's beta, and later on, we actually do get to see that this version mostly resembles the level 2 Bubbler. And if the level 2 Bubbler had 2,000 bubbles in the final game, I'd definitely be using it much more for sure. There of course are plenty of items here that I didn't cover, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. I do know one however, and it's in the bottom left, and it's labeled as the rocket parts at one point in the gameplay. Purpose unknown, however, it could have been a potential item used to take your missile launcher up to super. Moving on to the next screenshot in this build, we see Curly Brace firing the beta machine gun at a long green enemy found in underwater levels. And to the right, we can finally bring up the Mimiga lost to time, Sue. Sue is a Mimiga who is very prevalent and important in the beta. Oh, one thing I should mention is that this Sue is much different from the Sue we've come to know and love. First off, this Sue's name is spelled S-U, with those 2 letters followed by a hyphen. Sue is an interesting Mimiga and would later go on to inspire both Toriko and, well, Sue. Anyways, Sue discussion over for now. Just look how cute Mimiga look in goggles and a snorkel. The final screenshot we have for this build is an encounter with the Poo boss. In this screenshot, the Poo is talking about how Mimiga are much easier to eat if they're soaked in water. We'll have more context for this later on, although some basic context clues might already lead many of you in the right direction. How are we doing so far? It probably feels a bit weird to see the Cave Story we know after looking at all those beta and alpha builds of the game. Well, trust me, it's only going to get weirder. We're going to move on to the July 7th, 2001 beta build, and this version of the beta isn't just any beta. This is the beta. Chances are, when people talk to or refer to Cave Story's beta, this is the build they're referring to. And man, we have a lot to discuss here. First off, I should mention that this build of the game was first shared to us during a Game Developers Conference, or GDC, in 2011. Pixel actually put some really interesting commentary over it. I won't go over his commentary here, so for those interested, I'll leave a link to the video in the description below. Don't worry, there is English commentary in the second half of the video for those who don't understand Japanese. Either way, let's begin with the gameplay. Please forgive the quality, but sadly this is all we have. There is beta footage that was uploaded by YouTube user now_u, but sadly it doesn't cover all the footage shown by Pixel during GDC. so I'll do my best to display footage side by side with Pixel's GDC footage wherever possible. Getting right into the gameplay, we actually get to see Curly in an early version of the first cave. As I mentioned before, this area is actually called the Dim Path, and it's filled with small Pooh-like enemies to the brim. These enemies are honestly super cute, and I really wish they made it into the final game somewhere. But of course, I do love the diversity of enemies that we have in our version of Cave Story. Moving on, we get to see a more familiar area. Recognize it? This hill is actually the same hill we saw in the screenshots from the May 15th, 2001 build, which makes sense considering these builds are only 2 months apart. It seems like the only things that changed were Curly's color palette. Afterwards, Pixels takes us to an area that never made the final cut. According to the in-game text, this area is called the Thicket, possibly just referring to how green and grassy the area is. Pixel then cuts off to show more of these bat enemies. This big one we actually did get to see in the timeline from the beginning of the video. Pixel is using both the beta machine gun and the cynical blade, which actually showed much more projectiles on screen, and as we all know, a blade with multiple projectiles on screen in Final Cave Story would have been totally overpowered. Moving on, Pixel takes us to an area titled Pooh's Restaurant, as in, it literally translates to Pooh's Restaurant. Then, a Pooh comes in and is surprised that we aren't a Mimiga. Once again, these Poohs seem to really like Mimiga. After a short fight demo, we actually get to see Curly save a Mimiga from a bubble of water. In the beta, Pooh actually kept Sue in a bubble of water for Sue to die and then be eaten later on, as told through what he tells us through the next fight that Pixel shows with Pooh shortly after. Pixel then shows another Pooh fight taking place underwater, this time with Pooh having tons of little minions with them. The next Pooh fight, Pixel is fighting a Pooh who also has a smaller enemy with larger eyes. This enemy, when hit, will turn into a cloud and strike lightning whenever Curly is under them. This really feels similar to Misery's black orb attack during the boss fight with her in the final game. After showing off all the Pooh fights, Pixel then goes on to talk about how Sue is used to progress the story for the player and shows gameplay of Curly talking to Sue about how she has things to do elsewhere and invites the player along. Apparently, I never recorded audio for this section of this gameplay, but it's honestly really simple. Sue is just talking to other Mimiga as, once again, the story progressed through Sue. Moving along, we get to see a beta version of Living Waterway, but instead of the Curly that we know and love being with us, it's Sue, and instead we have to save Sue from drowning. It also looks like Dr. Giraud and his nurse will always plan to be in the game. However, Dr. Giraud is a wrong title. Dr. Giraud was actually used to be a frog prince, and is actually playable. It seems like the frog prince was meant to go around to bypass the water current and make it to the doorway that would later go on to be used to drain all the water from Curly Brace that we know. Next up, we have this really weird room that Quote is put into with a bunch of faces looking right at the player. I like to call this the vibe check room. The longer you stare at it, the better you pass. Next up, we actually get to see an early version of the Pooh Black fight, and this is interesting because Pooh Black is one of the very few beta elements that made it into the final game. Next up, Pixel takes us into another Pooh boss fight, but something interesting about this boss fight is that later on, a giant Pooh jumps into the fight. And actually, this is the last boss fight that Pixel worked on before actually giving up on the beta, so this is as far as you could possibly get in the beta build. And sadly, that's all the gameplay we have for the build of the beta. And man, I can rewatch this footage all day. I could really talk about my favorite bits and break it down to the pixel, no pun intended. But we can do that later. With that said, we're now halfway through the development timeline, and if you've made it this far, please congratulate yourself with a glass of ice cold water. Don't forget to stay hydrated. All good? Sweet. Let's move on. Well, we're now in an interesting part of the timeline, a part that doesn't exist, yet does. There is one beta build from 2002 that wasn't recorded on the timeline, but it seems like it wasn't for pretty clear reasons. Despite the year gap, it seems to be just a more refined version of the 2001 beta. There aren't too many screenshots, but still stuff you might find interesting. First screenshot we have is of Curly talking to a Mimiga. I'm unsure of what this conversation is about, but I do know Sue is involved. The next screenshot we have is probably the most interesting. We finally get to see the in-game shop that would have been in the game. It also seems like this black cat would have been the shopkeeper. Looks like the Cynical Blade would have also cost us 392 coins. Wow, that's a lot. Next, we have this screenshot of what appears to be the bridge when you first enter the plantation, but I could very well be wrong on that. The enemies on the bridge do have striking similarities though. And for our final screenshot, we get to see Curly Brace walking in some sort of cave with some rooms filled in with red dragon enemies that we've seen before. This area actually kind of gives me Falling Tower vibes without actually looking like the Falling Tower. Something about its maze-like nature, I guess. Alright, clearly Cave Story's beta looks nothing like our Cave Story, and that's simply because it isn't. It was a much different game with themes and stories still being unknown to this day. We know elements from the story, like Pooh wanting to feast on Mimiga and plot being carried on through Sue, but there's only so much the community can pull from this information at this time. That said, before moving back to the game, I'd like to take a look at some beta elements that didn't really fit into this video in the development timeline format. The main works here are going to be artwork from Pixel made just for the beta. These 4 images are really cool. The top left image is actually the only one Pixel has spoken openly about. A fan asked Pixel about the characters in the screenshot as well as plot details, but Pixel just pointed out who the characters were. Of course, we see Curly Brace, a Mimiga, a human girl, and a man in a lab coat. Now, for Cave Story fans who have no idea what's about to be said, this might blow your minds. Starting off with the Mimiga, it's simply an early design for Sue with markings under her eyes. Pixel goes on to actually say that he's forgotten Sue's origin, which I'm sad to tell you that. The man above Sue is actually the man who made Curly Brace, and the fact that he was completely scrapped is astonishing, as nobody has ever known who made the duo in the game. That said, with this character still being scrapped, he most likely isn't the one who made them in the final game, but it's still amazing that knowing at one point, the question of who made Curly unquote did have an answer. Finally, we have the unknown girl on the right. Now, hold on to your pants, folks. The girl on the right is actually Misery. Yeah, in the beta, it seems Misery and Curly Brace were actually on the same side to some extent. Of course, by the end of today's cave story, we know that Misery has her own values and emotions, but to see that Misery was on the hero's side at one point is so mind-blowing to me. I personally really like Misery and would have loved to see a more human side of her. Getting to see her think for herself and against the Doctor as well is a really cool scene in Cave Story, and I wish we had more of that. Now, moving on, let's talk about other pieces of the artwork. We sadly don't have any story bending elements to talk about like the first image. The top right image shows an early version of the island, which is neat to see that even Cave Story's beta had an island involved. The next image is of a ton of baby poo as well as a regular poo in the back on the left. The last image is, again, of Sue, Curly, and the old man, but this other girl we actually don't know. It looks a lot like Mamoru and Sakamoto, but elements like skin tone as well as the lack of confirmation tell us otherwise. Now, just for the sake of being in love with Pixel's art style, I want to of course show these art pieces of Curly Brace, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Some changes include Curly canonically having a cat on their shirt, as well as these amazing gloves, which I actually talked about during the Blade Strangers video. Besides design changes, however, there's not too much to talk about these other than the fact that they're really neat. Next up, we actually do have this artwork of Sue, and I really like this. Sue is adorable, and I really wish there was more fan art of her. There is some out there, like this cute artwork made by user BigBrawler2 on Reddit, but Sue sadly did get the short end of the stick whenever it comes to fan art. Good thing official art actually fills in a bit of the humor fan art can bring. Here's a picture of Sue and Curly, but Curly is this massive tank of a robot. It really makes it seem like Sue is some sort of stand user from JoJo and Curly is her stand. Okay, now for something really fun. As many of you know, Cave Story is known for its iconic music. Well, there's actually a handful of unused and beta songs, but I will give a heads up, I don't want to make this segment of just music playing, but I do feel it's important to talk about some of the rad music the beta had. I'll go ahead and play a few of my favorite tracks and we'll move on. If you really want to listen to all of the beta music, it's all up on the tribute site for download, and a few videos are out there with the whole beta soundtrack. Please enjoy the tracks. finally moving back to the betas, the 2002 beta is really interesting as it seems to be the last of what we know of as the Cave Story beta. From here on out, we'll be talking about Pixel's development reset. I guess you can technically say the beta part of the video is over. Some of you might have questioned to yourself how the game changed so much in the span of only 2 more years of development. While it's true that Cave Story was made over the span of 5 years, the Cave Story we know is actually made in about 2.5. Pixel wasn't happy with how the beta was coming out or turning into, so he completely trashed everything and started from scratch, keeping only a few elements that got into the final game. We sadly don't have anything really to look out from 2003 to 2004 betas, besides the sprites that Pixel gives us in the development timeline. To this day, we have no idea what the simming sprite was used for, but major breakthroughs and common sense tell us that it might have been used for a possible swimming mechanic. It seems like this was completely dropped though, as water is naturally a fairly big environmental enemy in Cave Story. Outside of this, there really are no beta builds we can look at, like I said before. There are a few screenshots however. Again, thanks to Aya for showing me this. There are apparently blog posts that seemingly got to talk to Pixel about Cave Story's pre-release version, and he shares screenshots there, although there are only a few changes. The first screenshot we have shows quote in the Grasstown or Bushland sections of the game, whichever you prefer. The first change we can see is that the level down text is in all capitals, with down being much larger than the word level. The next change we see here is the bike Kazuma and Professor Booster used to leave Grasstown/Bushlands. Here the bike is yellow, but in the final game, the bike is pink. Oh, by the way, did I mention these changes were going to be incredibly minor? Anyways, on to the next screenshot. We see quote entering the sand zone and the teleporter leads almost immediately into the level. In the final Cave Story, there's a small hallway where you first get to see Curly Brace, but it seems like in the pre-release there was no hallway. I guess you were meant to see Curly Brace later on in the level. Okay, this last screenshot is actually really cool. Here, quote is on the iconic outer wall, but the major change is with the night ghosts. They look a lot more angrier and violent in here. Definitely not as cute as they are in the final game, but hey, at least the night ghosts have little paw beans. Finally, we're at our final topic for the video, and that's going to be cut content. The following content has been found in Cave Story's final build as leftover data, but never goes used. That said, I would also like to say that there is some cut content found in the freeware version of Cave Story that I won't be covering in this section of the video, but that's only because some of the content that was cut before went on to be used in future releases of the game. For example, I won't be talking about the data for Wind Fortress in this video because that's for another day. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with some enemies. First off, we'll be looking at this owl that would have appeared in Egg Corridor 1. Sadly, there's not much to say here. Just an owl that would have been in an early level of the game. Personally, I think that they would have been nice enemies for the outer wall, but that's just me. Next, we have this green frog enemy that would have been in the Grasstown/Bushlands. And I really like this lad. He has a little knife and it looks like he meant business. This enemy actually did technically get officially released as artwork in an early version of OrgView, which is a music player that Pixel released as he slowly worked on Cave Story. However, again, that's also for another video. Moving on, we have a puppy with wings that would have appeared in the sand zone. I'm not sure where I read this, so take this with a grain of salt, but I believe the enemy could have been used to be a fake puppy to try and trick the player and attack them. But again, don't look too into it. This clearly didn't make the final build for reasons. Next, we have these unused droll-like enemies. They seem to have a few of their sprite works done, and I like to think that these drolls would have been used for the lower levels of the plantation, but we'll never truly know what these drolls were meant to be used for. And finally, probably the most interesting of the bunch, we have unused sprites of the Possessed, Misery, and Sue. The sprites we have here are of them apparently performing an unused charge attack that both of them would have had. And it certainly would have been annoying as the Undead Core fires plenty of projectiles as is. We don't need more in that fight, and that's probably why these attacks were cut. Next, we have a sprite of Possessed Misery this time, and it's of Misery covering her head in either fear, pain, or, well, misery. This sprite honestly freaks me out a bit, I'm not gonna lie. I always found Possessed Misery a bit creepy as is, as she was forcefully deformed, and seeing this beast version of her feel emotion and fear makes me freak out a bit for what the hell she might have been scared of. I'ma just take it off the screen now and not think of it ever again. And the final unused character that we have is an NPC, and it's a Mimiga soldier and or medic, and they look adorable. These Mimiga would have probably been used as guards for jail cells or maybe tending to the Mimiga in the sprinkler room. Either way, they're unused, and it's a shame that we never got to see them walk around with their little hats. And there we have it. I have finally covered Cave Stories Beta. Now, allow me to cover some ground, as yes, there are a few screenshots as well as some unused sprites like the Ika-chan arrow and even a tidbit of gameplay. But these screenshots and things I felt wouldn't have shown much of interest, but I will of course leave plenty of links below on where you can find these things, as there is still a handful of stuff that didn't make this video. I hope all of you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Before I end off, I promised updates in the Mimiga video and challenge levels videos. I'd like to start off that by saying that the challenge level videos is back in production. Nicalis dropped an update fixing the crashing bug, and all I need is the footage of the levels. As far as the Mimiga video, some of you know I had to restart that video because it wasn't up to the quality that I liked. The video is going to be postponed to an unknown time now, but don't worry, it will eventually come once I finally figure out what I want to do with it. Apologies for those who were looking forward to it. Now, with updates out of the way, I would like to once again say that this is by far my longest cave story video, and it will probably stay that way, at least for a while. I hope all of you guys learned something from this video as well. Again, huge thanks to Aya, Enlightened One, and the Pixel Beta Content Discord server. And of course, thank you all so much for watching. I really can't stress how much it means for you guys to be so enthusiastic about a video. I hope to see you guys all in my next one, and until then, Nerdieo is out.